You're listening in on an animated discussion about Superman the Animated Series with two experts in their fields. I'm Joshua Unruh, superhero scholar.
And I'm Caleb Masters, your friendly neighborhood film critic extraordinaire from thecinematropolis.com. And today's topic is feeding time. Joshua, I've had parasites on the brain a lot lately, and we'll save it for alternate media recommendations to find out, so listeners can find out why. But either way, when I saw we were talking about Parasite today, I was like, this aligns with where my headspace has been a lot in the last month. So,
man, you jumped to alternate media recommendations before I could make a joke about how I'm sorry about your medical condition.
Oh,
dang it,
man. I mean,
I got parasites on the brain and on the intestine. Anyway, that's a terrible joke. I regret everything.
So Parasite, I just gotta throw this out there, Joshua. I am not super savvy with this character. Like, I don't know. I know who he is. I know what his power is. But outside of that, I wasn't particularly knowledgeable about this character. Don't know a lot about his origin. Couldn't even remember a lot about his personality. So I was like, okay, cool. I don't remember this episode either. So I'm looking forward to diving in. And I gotta say, I was pleasantly surprised by a super powerful guy who doesn't know how to use his powers. I thought it was actually very fun.
Yeah, or he's not using them optimally, right? Like, you and I, who are better people than Rudy Jones, would think bigger than this if we were going to be villains, right? And we'd still be like, we can do better than Rudy. And I think that's part of the point of him. That's pretty good.
Yeah. So I don't want to get too far ahead. So let's just talk about this design at first, because
just the design.
The design. I have to say, I am not impressed with the design. Now, that said, though, I'm not super familiar with the character outside of what we see in the DCAU. But for a character called Parasite, he just seems kind of vanilla and a little lazy. But I don't know. Maybe you could fill in some blanks for me.
Well, this look is very comic book accurate. That may or may not excuse the choices, you know? And actually, I don't love the whole design either. There are parts of it that I think are legitimately stupendous, but there are other parts that I'm like, that's from the comics, but you didn't have to do it, you know? Comic book wise, he has ranged from a very humanoid look, kind of like what we get in this show, all the way out to like a big scary leech monster that is just a big mouth and engorged body. He's been all over the place.
See, the latter sounds like what I would expect.
Yeah, and I mean, not for nothing, the most famous, for my money, the most famous use of that look is in an issue of All-Star Superman where Clark Kent is interviewing Lex Luthor in prison, and they happen to be bringing Parasite like as a prisoner transfer when that's going on, and he is close enough to Superman to absorb a little bit of his power just being near him, and Clark Kent has to deal with that while not giving away his secret identity to the legit smartest man in the world. It's a very good issue, and it's not mostly about Parasite, but he escalates from this like little emaciated purple version of the gray alien, like that's kind of what he looks like. He goes from that all the way up to this like room-filling leech monster, because that's what Superman's power level does to him. Right. So he's really all over the place as far as the look.
Yeah, but so you feel like this design though aligns pretty well with the comics and fits well with the aesthetic of Superman animated series?
I would say yes, with a little bit of a question mark. So I'll say the part that I love the most about this design, and then the part that weirds me out or just makes me confused. I love his facial expressions so much. Like, they are humanoid, but also clearly not human. And they're just suggested with a darker shade of purple, except for these big blank glowing eyes. It's like recognizably person-like, but also so non-human that it creeps me out. And then you have this like total mook voice come out of it. It's a very jarring juxtaposition of elements, and I like that a lot.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point. Like it definitely feels inhuman in that sense. I do like how his voice is not match his body, because you'd almost expect something with like a less emotion, but he's like this really kind of goofy, over the top character. And I gotta say, you know, and we'll talk more about it here in a moment, but like I do like how much even just his voice changes when he goes from Rudy to Parasite.
Yeah, absolutely. He goes from a guy who wishes he could be a bully to a guy who can actually be a bully. And his kind of nasally, don't hurt me voice becomes something. It's still recognizably the same person, but it drops a couple of octaves because now he's got some swagger thanks to this stolen power, which is a lot of character stuff. Like that's wrapped up in there. The last thing on the look, the thing that confuses me the most, this Fifth Element style swimsuit that he's wearing is technically comic book accurate, but I don't know where he got it or why he got it in terms of this episode. So it's technically accurate, but I really don't like it. It doesn't make sense here. And I wonder if it's basically here so that they didn't have to draw him as a naked purple man.
What are you talking about, Joshua? That was what was underneath the clothes he was wearing when the toxins fell on his body. You didn't see those?
Oh, I'm not touching that. Absolutely not.
Okay. Oh, gosh. All right. Sorry. I just had to throw it out
think
there.
that's a great explanation, but it creates more questions than it answers.
Oh, yeah. But, hey, we get another notable design from Superman in this episode as well. So we get the anti-kryptonite suit. So now that we've gotten through a little piece of home, we see that his friendship with Dr. Emil Hamilton has paid off. He now has an anti-kryptonite suit that keeps, I guess, makes him totally resistant or mostly resistant to kryptonite. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I really like this suit conceptually. I especially like that it shows up after kryptonite. You know, so it makes sense that they made it in response to the existence of kryptonite, but then it becomes useful in this episode in a completely different way. That is very cool. On the design level, though, I think it's like super boring, and I wish that they had put literally any effort into it other than stenciling an S on the chest. I don't love it. The look of it, right? It's just... the technology on Superman the Animated Series is exceptionally boring until we introduce Fourth World tech.
Right. Yep. And I do think, yeah, the design here it's pretty lazy. Cool, but lazy. I mean,
cool idea that's just executed in a lackluster way. Like, it does its job and it's branded Superman, but it's like, if you know what, if we saw it in the next episode or whatever the next time we saw it and it was tricked out and painted, I would be like, oh, it was a prototype. Okay, but this is how it's going to look forever because we've already seen it in World's Finest, which is down the road a piece for the internal chronology.
Yeah. We'll see. And I know we did get a peek at that in the World's Finest episode, but I guess this is technically the debut. Is there, Joshua, I think, was there any other costumes you wanted to talk about today?
I had one tiny mention just because it fascinates me the time and effort that these creators are putting into Lois. Lois got another outfit. It's a robin's egg blue palette swap. So it's still her usual, like, relatively short skirt business blazer, you know, but done in these blue tones. And I don't think we see it a lot because I remember the red and black one and I remember the lavender one. But I think it's really cool that they are going to this effort to make Lois look very stylish without overtaxing the illustrators. It's a good look.
Yeah. It is interesting. It's interesting, like, where they choose to put their resources, because on one hand we've got the Superman
right.
suit that seems like they just kind of phoned it in. On the other hand,
yes.
Lois is getting new costume designs all the time. So I mean, no shade, because yeah, it's I actually appreciate that Lois keeps it fresh, but it just kind of given some of the other sacrifices they make in the animation and design choices throughout the show, it's an interesting place to put those resources.
I mean, most of Lois's changes are, like I say, just palette swaps, right? So that's one explanation, but they also didn't have to do it, like, at all, even that. So considering Lois is one of my top 5 characters in superhero comics, I like that they're giving her that love.
Got it. Well, Joshua, let's get back to Parasite, and I need you to do me a favor. Go ahead, take me to school, because I honestly don't know much about this character other than what his powers are. He saps Superman's energy and then uses it like Superman's like a battery, which we see in this episode. He saps his power and he has some of Superman's powers temporarily that fade over time.
That's basically his power set, and whoever he can come in contact with will make him commensurately stronger, right? Like if he absorbs the energy of an average person, he now has the strength of 2 men, himself and that person, you know. But if he can absorb it from Superman, look out. So there have actually been several versions of Parasite. I'm going to zero in on the first 2 because it's the first one who showed up pre-Crisis. For those of you who've heard me talk about Crisis on Infinite Earths, it's a very big pivot, both internally for the continuity of DC and also metatextually for the direction of the company. That happened in 1985, 1986. Before that, the first Parasite showed up in Action Comics number 340 in 1966. So he's been around a minute, but he's not like 30s and 40s old.
Yeah, he's like the next generation of Superman villains, not the original run or the first batch, but he came around when they about 20 or so years later. Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. You got a rash of very interesting villains here, like Terra Man, who actually becomes a partner of the Parasite later, and a whole bunch of others. I will not bore you, but nevertheless, the reason I bring up the original pre-Crisis one is because that's where the look, the purple and swimsuit look comes from originally. Rudy Jones was introduced in Firestorm Volume 2, number 58 in 1987.
Okay, so about 10 years before this episode aired.
Yeah, that's right. And Rudy, his version is kind of weird. It's kind of a strange meta origin where Darkseid remembers the existence of the original Parasite, even though that universe no longer exists. And so he manipulates Rudy into gaining the Parasite's powers, but he is like a little green dude at first. And it's only later when prison doctors at Bel Rev try to cure him that he turns purple and his power levels are increased a lot, like more like what we see in this episode.
So Darkseid is actually the one who kind of is the puppet master and creates this version of Parasite?
Yes, because of his memories of a universe that no longer exists, that nobody but us, the readers, remember.
Does Darkseid remember this?
Yes,
okay.
Darkseid remembers it because Darkseid is an extreme. Oh, we will talk about Darkseid eventually, my friends. But in brief, he is a personification, like a living idea of evil, and exists outside of what the DC universe would consider traditional time and space.
Right. I love it. I mean, as listeners know, I've heard me talk about before, I love puppet master type villains, and even though it doesn't appear that Darkseid is in any way connected with this version of Parasite on Superman the Animated Series, I love the idea that this is based on the version that Darkseid sort of like led or created in a certain way. That's really fun.
And then just walked away. Like he had him more or less created, like tricked him into creating it, and then was like, all right, my job's done here, and didn't really involve himself with Rudy very much more.
It's
awesome.
Wild. Now, now speaking of Rudy, bringing it back to the episode, I found I like Rudy a lot because, firstly, he's not even a good criminal. Like, they're trying to steal the thing, and he gets caught, and he's just like basically like is like, all right, jig's up, I guess we're done, and his partner pushes back. And I found that it interesting what getting dosed with the chemicals did to his psychology, because he was basically I mean a wimp. Like, so he is like a step below petty criminal, as in he's maybe committing crimes.
Yeah, he's a dupe.
Yeah, but like how that gave him a lot more confidence, because he knew he was more powerful, so he then in turn bullied other people who bullied him. That's cool, but it's funny that like that's the end of his ambitions. He's like, all right, I'm just gonna go rob some banks and mess with people I don't like, you know?
Yes, I actually really appreciate that part of his character, that whole thing. It's like a mini arc for Rudy. I mean, everybody's very familiar with the famous phrase, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But there is a new and growing school of philosophy, like for real, that rejects that premise and says that power actually just brings out the person you are always going to be anyway, right? Like the ability to do whatever you want will show us what it is you want to do.
Right.
You know? And with Rudy being such a mealy-mouthed, low-rent criminal, like he's not even really a criminal. He's a janitor who got in deep with a bookie or something, and somebody's going to bail him out as long as he will help them steal some stuff. And then as soon as he gets the power to be a bully, he is the biggest bully of all bullies. But he never stops being that small horizon petty criminal. He's now knocking over banks instead of convenience stores, but he's still just stealing stuff. There's no would-be world beater in Rudy.
Right. No, I think it's funny because he's still wildly incompetent. Like he's accomplishing what he's setting out to do, but like he was incompetent.
His
before
ambitions are so small.
Yes. Yeah. And I mean, if it wasn't for the Superman's power, he would just be even with the powers of Parasite. Without Superman, he would still just be like going around like just draining the life out of like dudes who are a little bigger than him. You know, like he has,
right.
He's not thinking, oh, I could use this to take the presidency or the White House, or I could use this to generate infinite wealth. No. He's just like, all right, cool. I can finally go rob that bank. I'm moving up, buddy. I'm going from robbing the grocery store cashier to robbing First National Bank, or if it's in Gotham, the Second National Bank.
I will say that his lack of ambition is one of the reasons that I consider Parasite one of the perfect C-list Superman villains.
Yeah, Joshua, I find the pettiness of it to be funny, and it's certainly different
right.
than a lot of Superman's other villains who, at least, I mean, even Toyman, like, had bigger ambitions. You know, he's building giant robots and kidnapping people, and
he at least had vengeance to keep him warm at night, right?
Right.
Rudy just wants to sleep on a pile of money.
Exactly. I mean, Rudy has no vision for what he really wants. He just knows that, you know, he's just like, it's day to day, small, petty. Wants to be the biggest guy in the room.
Once he figures out that he can steal the thoughts of people, you're absolutely right. Like nuclear codes or even bank codes to steal billions without leaving your house. You know, there's all kinds of things he could do, and he doesn't. He just goes and robs places, and then when he runs into Superman, he robs bigger places. But there is kind of a Superman thematic reason that I find him so perfect. I mean, partly I really like that this is what happens when criminals get powers. They don't become world beaters. They're still criminals. They just commit bigger crimes. I like that because it's consistent with his psychology, you know, as a character.
Right.
But what I like him doing to Superman is that he preys directly on what I kind of think of as Superman's three biggest fears, right? And like last episode, I mentioned that I'm tired of hearing the Bruce Wayne should just pay taxes and give away all his money. That would fight crime better than Batman, because it just ignores a whole bunch of genre nonsense. But at least that's not coming from writers, right? That's coming from readers. The Superman version of that comes from writers. Let's give him bigger stuff to lift.
Right.
That'll challenge him.
Right.
No, you've got to hit him in his heart. And the three things that he's terrified of, that Parasite exploits by accident, is that Superman is absolutely terrified of his powers going out of control.
Yep.
He is terrified of being powerless himself just because he has never been powerless, right? Like, does he remember what it's like to get a cold or a paper cut? And lastly, he is terrified of his secret identity being revealed not on his terms.
Wow.
And Parasite hits all three of those without even realizing it. But we know it. The viewers know it, and it's kind of awesome.
No, it's really funny, and that was one thing question I had for you actually, was how. And I again do not recall what the follow up to this episode is with Parasite, but I'm thinking, how has he not leveraged the secret identity somehow? Like either as a ransom or to get something, and maybe he will. I hope he does, honestly, because I'm like, holy smokes, you're sitting on Superman's secret identity, and you're just like, oh, that's cool, you know, like.
You know, I think there's a couple of mitigating factors in this episode on that. He does lean into the secret identity stuff more down the road, but in terms of this episode, I think it makes a lot of sense. Superman has not been around very long, right? So maybe nobody has realized he has a secret identity yet. He doesn't wear a mask. You know, he doesn't pretend to be, you know, like you look at Batman and Robin and you go, those people are hiding something. Superman's biggest defense of his secret identity is most people not realizing he has one.
Right. Yep.
And that's actually a Lex Luthor thing. Like when Lex Luthor gets indisputable proof that he's Clark Kent, he rejects it because he doesn't believe that Superman would pretend to be that guy. When in fact, as we know, it's the other way around. Clark Kent pretends to be Superman.
Exactly.
So there's not a lot of value attached to the secret identity in general, and I think that's doubly so for Parasite. Parasite just wants bars of gold and sacks of money. He's not going to get that blackmailing a working class journalist.
Right. There's not enough for what he wants. There's not enough in it for him, really. He doesn't really see the value.
Yes, that's what I think is true. It didn't even occur to him, and even if it did, he would have set it aside in favor of opening another vault.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, not a big picture thinker, you know. He just is like, how can I get more money now? Joshua, one thing I just want to throw at you, and I don't know, this might be taking us back a little bit to the origin story piece. I did find the whole quick psychology, like the psychology is consistent, but the whole like kind of personality swap a little bit to feel a little Joker-esque, like the whole vat of acid, instead of vat of acid, it's vat of chemicals.
Oh,
not a huge thing. I just thought it was worth noting. Like the origin story is kind of similar. They're just two very different people.
Yeah, I think that's a fine example of the difference between an A-lister and a C-lister, right? Like the origin is similar, but then the personality that Joker becomes is completely divorced from whatever there was before when you even get to know it. Like 3/4 of the time or more, we don't even know who Joker was before he was Joker.
Right.
Whereas Rudy just becomes more Rudy.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Super Rudy.
Yes, which actually winds up being not that impressive because Rudy wasn't that impressive to start with, you know?
Oh.
And that actually segues, I think, really well into where we're keeping an eye on Superman's power level.
Yes, it's time for the Superman power level check-in. And Joshua, I gotta say, we didn't actually see too much of his powers, though we got to see Parasite use his powers.
That's the part that I find interesting,
yes.
is that we see a couple of things that are very on point with his powers. I really liked seeing in the very opening scene how visible and palpably uncomfortable Superman was being that close to kryptonite.
Oh, yeah.
Like, it's the only thing that's really hurt him since he was 10 years old. And so now that it's sitting there, even though he's not feeling the effects, he's inside the suit, he still looks really worried. And I like that. It makes sense. You know, remember when we introduced it in Far From Home, he was hiding behind machinery and talking to them from across the room. And we see that even though he's in the suit. The other thing that I wondered is, and we should keep an eye on this when he first uses it, he puts out a fire by breaking through a wall and getting a water pipe instead of blowing it out. And I just wonder if maybe he doesn't even know he has super breath yet.
You know, he was out of breath, Joshua, because I guess Superman can be out of breath. He was tired of breathing. So he's like, I'm just going to use this water right here. Not exactly what I would say the most environmentally friendly way to stop the thing, you know, using the water, valuable resources of water. But no, sorry. I had to throw that joke in there. No, yeah, I think maybe he doesn't realize it. It is interesting just thinking through, like, how does Superman know when to use which of his powers? And maybe he doesn't know what they are yet, but it's...
Well, remember, we're early, right? And we've noticed before that he didn't know how invulnerable he was. He dodged bullets until he got hit by some, and he dodged missiles until he got hit by some. And then he gets knocked all over the place instead of using his flight to sort of counterbalance, you know, that impact. And that's why I immediately thought, oh, I bet he hasn't discovered it yet. And I will be very interested to see if they do. It doesn't have to be a whole episode, but if they do a moment where he goes, well, let me try something, and then, you know, uses the super breath to blow something out or freeze it. It was pretty cool. Pretty cool.
Yeah. That's a nice touch. And I guess what strikes me about the power levels in this episode, Joshua, is that Superman is really relying on his wit to get out of his get out of trouble in this one, so to speak. You know, he's using his wit to beat Parasite because, you know, Parasite's not that bright, so he has to. And with Superman being low on power, I mean, it really is up to him to outthink or think at least 2 steps ahead to get the advantage, which again I think goes against the reputation Superman has among a lot of less well-read Superman or readers or viewers that Superman's a big dumb brute Boy Scout. No, he's actually very sharp and can think fast on his feet, figuring out how he can leverage his powers and thinking about how he can leverage the tools at his disposal. So again, I think this episode does a great job at showcasing that side of Superman that we haven't seen yet.
We watched Superman's powers make Rudy more Rudy, right? The power didn't change him, it just made him more himself. More of the bully, more of the swagger, more of the I can take it now. And in this very same episode, we got to see that losing those powers does not make Superman less Superman. He's still smart and resourceful and brave, and that's a good example of him being the big blue Boy Scout. He's always prepared. He's always thinking ahead. He's always looking out for people, even when he is not at his most powerful. I love that character beat so much.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a good touch. One other thing I think we should touch on before we wrap up our convo on the episode, Jimmy Olsen. So, I guess when we started talking about this show, you had laid out there how this show kind of has a certain level of disrespect or disdain for Jimmy, and I didn't really fully see it. I was like, okay, well, we'll wait and see. I know it does take away a few things about Jimmy that are iconic, like the bow tie, for example, and it's kind of downplaying his role. But
I would almost say they take away everything iconic and interesting about Jimmy for this show.
Yeah, because what struck me in this episode was actually how absolutely incompetent Jimmy was the entire time. He does one thing, and it's like loosen the chain, and that's it. That's all he does. And I was like, well, I mean, Superman, they could have figured out a way to write him out extremely easily. So at this point, it was just wasted screen time because they didn't really. It honestly didn't even make Jimmy look that good because Superman had to like summon him or you know what I mean? Like I don't know. It's just It's not a good use of Jimmy at all. I think it makes him look. Even though he does help, I think he ends up coming across looking dumber rather than more useful.
I appreciate that they kind of tried, and if I'm honest, it might have worked better for me if I didn't know how great a character Jimmy can and has been. But he's just never going to approach that level on this show. I've made my peace with it, but it bothers me when I kind of have my nose rubbed in the fact that he's never going to be very good. I mean, for instance, just again to reference, there is a Jimmy Olsen focused issue of All-Star Superman that starts out with Jimmy in a fantastic situation. And I mean fantastic in the classical sense, like it's overwhelming and almost like magic, and he has to use his signal watch to call for help. But when Superman comes to help him, something happens where he has to turn around and save Superman, and no one but Jimmy can do it. And it's not loosening a chain. Like, Jimmy goes to the mattresses for his best friend in that issue. And that's just, I bring that one up because it's just one, 25-page example, but Jimmy Olsen had like 400 plus issues of Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen, where certainly he called for help from Superman fairly often, but he also got himself into and out of scrapes on his own a lot. He was very resourceful. It's about that creating a character that you could believe would be Superman's friend, that Superman would consider a friend.
Right.
He's got to be something interesting, and that's not going to be the case on this show.
It's just like they just wrote him in there to be like, to show that Superman's got a pals, but I don't actually believe that they're friends. Other than the fact that
I don't think they're committed to it. I don't think the writers are aware of it, but they're not committed to it. And again, it's fine. It's fine. It's just disappointing to me because Jimmy is legit one of my favorite superhero characters.
Well, no, and I feel that disappointment, and it just seems to me, based on just the show that I've seen so far with this viewing, is the reason that he summons Jimmy is because they work together at the Daily Planet as Clark Kent and Jimmy Olsen, and Jimmy Olsen happens to be the photographer taking the photos. Like, but that's it. Like, he would have no other like, there really isn't appear to be any other reason why Superman would work with Jimmy. It's just, other than that he's a guy in his life.
Yep, I really think that this show just decided that Jimmy didn't make sense as Superman's pal, and instead they make him Clark Kent's pal, which puts him kind of in the mix with Superman now and then. But I think that these guys largely really understand these characters, but that's an example of where they just didn't know what to do with Jimmy and did their best, and their best is just okay.
Just okay. Well, Joshua, before we close out our talk on Feeding Time, I did have to get some alternate media recommendations. Now, I have mine that I've already tipped my hand to a little bit, but I want to see what you have first. So what would you recommend listeners read, watch, or play if they enjoyed Feeding Time?
I have one recommendation, but it's kind of a big one, and I have to be a little circumspect about why I'm suggesting it to avoid spoilers. But I highly recommend the Fox television series Fringe.
Ooh, great pick.
It is a great show. It really does do next generation level up X-Files extremely well. There are elements of weird super science that remind me of Star Labs in it, but the real reason that I picked it out, and this is the part that I got to be real careful about, but Parasite could have basically taken over Superman's life, like replaced Superman and Clark Kent, and no one... Well, he would have had to put some work into it, but no one would have been the wiser. He had all of his memories, all of his knowledge. He could have done it. Fringe also often plays with the idea of what if you were replaced by a perfect copy and no one noticed. Not your loved ones, not your best friend, not your lover, not your coworkers. No one figured it out. How terrifying a concept would that be? And so that's why I bring up Fringe, because I think that's kind of the underlying thematic thing that makes Parasite such a great villain for Superman.
Yeah, absolutely, Joshua. I think that is a top-notch recommendation. Fringe is, I don't get the chance to say this very often on podcasts, so I'm just going to say it, is a hyper underrated show. I actually much prefer it over the X-Files. Talk about the level up piece you talked
100%.
about. I think it has a clearer vision. I think the weird science is more interesting. And I just feel like from the get-go, the characters are way more interesting than Mulder and Scully. That's probably controversial, but I'm just going to say it, and I mean it truthfully. Not that I don't like Mulder and Scully, but I really like the core family, kind of the family dynamic that cast has.
Yes.
More so than the buddy cop, the weird, sometimes romantic buddy cop, sometimes not relationship of Mulder and Scully. So, great recommendation. Okay, so... I tip my hand. This is purely off of the title. Okay, so we're talking about a villain named Parasite.
I know you're about to make a very high quality, but nevertheless extremely lazy recommendation, and I applaud it.
I know. I never do this, but I was like, I've been thinking. So, listeners, my favorite film of 2019 was a Korean film named from Bong Joon-ho called Parasite. Now, I will just say this, and I don't want to spoil the movie in any way, but it has nothing to do with Parasite in the way that you think about it, or even in the way that this episode is dealing with Parasite as a concept. So yes, face value, this is a very lazy recommendation, but I just really want people to go and see this movie because it is... I think it's and I try to avoid saying this so close to release on certain movies, but this movie is a masterpiece. It's the full package. It's got drama. It's got great social commentary. It's got great performances. It's got great writing. The first time I saw it, I was halfway through the movie and I was like, where is this going? Only for there to be things happen that blew my mind multiple times and it take a wildly different direction than what I thought I was watching. It is one of 2019's finest films. I believe this episode will probably drop sometime after the Oscars, so it could be an Oscar-winning film. And I know sometimes Oscar-winning films aren't great. It's all based of like weird politics stuff. No. This one's the real deal. This is #1 film of 2019. Parasite, all I will say about the story is it deals with two families, and it's about the haves and the have-nots. That's all I'm going to say because I just don't want to spoil it, but just know that it has the highest recommendation I can give any film. I saw it one time in theater and then went and saw it again 2 days later. And if it had been in the theater longer, I would have seen it a third time. It's that good. So that is Parasite, a film from Bong Joon-ho.
You know, we joke, but at the end of the day, the conflict between Rudy and Superman, as Rudy sees it, is very much a conflict between the haves and the have-nots. And he sees himself as not having the power to actualize the life he wants. But once we get to know him a little bit, we realize that his lack of power is not his biggest shortcoming.
Right.
It's a lack of imagination and a lack of moral fiber. So the have and have not actually goes both ways in different ways. So, you know, It's a little lazy, but there might be more going on there than you would think.
Joshua, thank you for adding value to that recommendation. I hadn't considered that at all, but I will take it. I will take it.
That about wraps it up for this animated discussion. If you enjoyed this conversation and would like to join in, come find us on Twitter. Caleb is at CMastersTalk, and I am at Joshua Unruh, and the hashtag is Animated Discussion. Caleb, where else can people find you?
I'm the editor-in-chief and contributor at the Cinematropolis, a website that specializes in in-depth film critique and analysis. I'm also the host of the Cinematropolis podcast, The Cinematic Schematic. We publish in-depth essays on all types of films, and you can find all those articles and the podcast right on over at thecinematropolis.com.
Remember that an animated discussion is a Pulp Diction Productions program and is 100% supported by listeners like you. To find out how you can keep this and our other shows in production, check out patreon.com/pulpdictionproductions. Show your support by pledging at Patreon or by leaving a great review on Apple Podcasts to make it easier for more people to find us and join in the discussion.
And of course, the links to Patreon, Apple Podcasts, our recommendations, and Twitter are all easy to find in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining us for this animated discussion, and we'll be back next time to talk about the new Batman adventures. Never fear.
Until next time, look up in the sky. It's a bird. It's a plane. It's an animated discussion.